Hi friends, and welcome to the Altenew Vintage Vibes video hop. Today I'm participating in this hop and featuring some gorgeous stamps and stencils from the latest release from Altenew. I'm creating a card using the watercolor extravaganza stamp set, and I'm using inks from the Summer Afternoon, Fall Harvest and Green Fields ink crisp dye inks. So let's pick out the first color, which is the lightest. It's called Butternut. And I'm inking up the first layer of these watercolor floral stamps. The best part about this stamp set is that even if you're a newbie and not that comfortable with layering, you are perfectly fine. They're designed to look whimsical and more like freehand watercolored florals. So even if you don't get them perfectly right, it looks gorgeous, believe me. So what you see me doing here is I'm stamping out the two big flowers multiple times by just rotating my piece of cardstock. And then because it's rectangular, I also trim it down further so that I can get a couple extra flowers. Although I originally only planned on using 4, I always create a few extras because who knows, I can mess up at any point during my card making. Next, I bring in the second layer of stamps for the flowers and position them on my MISTI. Once I have them lined up, I use Warm Sunshine to stamp these flowers. I do love the happy vibe that this ink color brings, and I enjoy using them for my flowers. A couple of things that I want to point out here. First of all, be very careful and wait for the ink colors to actually sink in and show through. I find a lot of times that when I stamp the first time, the colors are really nice and intense, but as the color actually sinks into the paper, it fades out and then it's barely visible. So depending on the type of paper you use, it's important to play and test your inks and know how they behave so that you get the best possible image or outcome for your cards. So in my case, I'm using Nina Solar White 80 pound, and when I stamp on this using my Altenew crisp dye inks, I like to go in with at least 2 stamping layers, or I stamp each layer 2 times so I get a nice crisp image. Finally, I have the third layer of stamps positioned on my MISTI and lined up. I'm using Pumpkin Pie. This is a color from the Fall Harvest Crisp Dye Inks family. I felt that it's a great combo and works well for my bright summer florals. So the other 2 ink colors I used are from Summer Afternoon, and the deeper yellow that I'm using for the third layer comes from the Fall Harvest set. So as usual, I go ahead and stamp out all the flowers, and then I move on to the greens for the center of the flower. For the larger circle area, I'm using Marshlands, that is from the Nature Wonders ink family. I actually did Misty more first, and I found it was a bit too light, and so I went back and used Marshlands over it. For the detail layer, I'm using Evergreen, which is my favorite super dark green ink, and it is from the Green Fields ink family. For the center of the second flower, I know there are 2 layers actually, but I decided I'm going to just keep it simple and do the simple 1 layer with the darker green ink. Next, I line up the dies and die cut all the flowers and set them aside. Now I'm going to move on to work on the background. So for this background, I'm using the Playful Patterns stencil set. This set has 4 different patterns, and I chose to use the leafy background to create my card panel for today. So I brought out a mossy green cardstock and positioned my stencil over it and used magnets to secure it in place. The ink I'm using today is a white pigment ink from Simon Says Stamp, and I'm using a sponge dauber to ink through my stencil. So once I'm happy with the coverage and applied ink across the stencil, I remove the stencil and dry my panel. Yes, pigment ink takes a lot of time to dry on its own, so I bring in my heat tool and make sure that I have it thoroughly dried. I'm directly drying on top of a heat-resistant silicone mat to protect my work surface. Next, I turn my cardstock around and then position the stencil again and go back to ink through it. So this gives me a little bit more coverage on my panel and fills up a lot of that empty green space with the white leaves. Once I do this, I realize that I still have a few empty white spaces gaping at me, and I wanted to fill out the leaves a little bit more evenly. So you can see that I just positioned the stencil in areas that I wanted to fill and quickly filled out 1 or 2 leaves in those areas, so I got more even coverage. Once I was happy with my stenciling, I go ahead and clean up my stencil and then bring in my heat tool to set my ink. Next, I'm going to work on my sentiment. I'm using the I Really Miss You stamp set to stamp out my sentiment. I use a darker shade of green for the miss word in between, and that is, I think, the evergreen ink. And then I bring in the lighter color, which is marshlands, to stamp out the I really and you part of the sentiment. Then I bring in my Altenew halftone square dies to die cut that sentiment. Now that I have all my card elements ready, I position my flowers and then realize that something is missing. I had completely forgotten my leaves. I wanted a little bit more green or greenery around my florals, so I went back and quickly stamped out the leaves. Once again, the best part about this set is that you don't have to worry about outline and then filling layers. It's just simple leaves, one single layer. So I did 3 leaves using marshlands and then a couple more, I think using green fields. And then I die cut those leaves and had all my elements spread out in front of me. Next, I created a little nest using some gold embroidery thread and positioned that right in the center where I planned to put on my sentiment. I used foam tape to pop up that sentiment and then went on to build my floral elements around the sentiment. Also, I made sure to use liquid adhesive for 1 layer of the flowers and then used foam to pop up the flower on top. So that way there's a little more dimension. I love adding dimension to my cards, which is not new. I did go ahead and tuck the leaves here and there. I used liquid adhesive to make sure they stay in place. But yeah, I just go around and play with it until, the arrangement looks pretty and it is all to my liking. So once I'm done with the panel, I prepare a side folding white card base and attach it to complete my card. I did want a little bit of something, embellishments or something shiny. So I go ahead and add some rainbow clear drops. So these are like the clear drops, but they have a rainbow shine to them. So yeah, I just use liquid adhesive, attach it down, and this completes my card. If you like my video, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for joining me. Have a lovely day.